I mean, so if you ever get a chance, I don't know if you're into movies or not, and just like, you don't have to watch the whole movie to get the real basic premise, but like Steam Boy is part of the steampunk genre. The technology is all steam based, right? And it takes place in Victorian times. And so instead of like the cyberpunk aesthetic where you have these big, rich mega corporations that are using all this high tech shit to package everybody's oppression for them, basically. In the steampunk genre, it's a Victorian age, so it's like industrialists that are trying to capture the power of steam technology for themselves to then repackage and product it, and then the people that are trying to use steam to fight them, right? So I'm not familiar. I've never read like biopunk or solar punk. There's all kinds of these punks, right? But if we're talking about trying to find a root name for this podcast, and we're talking about neurodiversity and what that means in an anarchist perspective, I don't know. I feel like neuropunk, like there might be something to that, right? Neurodiversity, like our neurology is powerful. It's wild. Each of us are so different, and yet so many of us are so similar. It's wild. So the idea of us making an anarchist podcast and really focusing on where we relate, which is not being neurotypical. I don't know. I think neuropunk could be cool, even if it sounds a little dated. I don't know. Maybe we go a little retro.
Yeah. So I just watched the other day the movie Blade Runner. I watched the remake because that was it was a long movie. But that kind of gets at a little bit of what you're talking about, I think, because in the movie it's a dystopia where people are being subjugated, but they don't think they're being subjugated, at least the people within the main community, because they've had their memories implanted. They've been kind of conditioned to believe that this is what's normal. And I thought it was a really great title. Like they basically reduce these people to these robotic, mechanical beings that only did their jobs, maybe engaged in some pleasurable activities. But aside from that, they were not free. And it was quite obvious that they were slaves to their society. And if they tried to break out of that, they'd be retired or arrested or killed by the community.
Right. Or like maybe recycled for material or something. Yeah, I love that movie.
Yeah,
I love that movie. It's so funny because I literally was talking about it on multiple podcasts in relation to things that I think are super relatable what's going on right now. And so keeping in mind this movie, I love these synchronicities that come up when I talk to people, man. It's so cool. The thing that I really took away recently as far as like what it means to be neurotypical or not in relationship to that movie is that in the movie, the replicants are sold with the guarantee that they'll be obedient and they cannot lie, right? But by the end of the movie, two of the main characters who are replicants lie. It's and lie to move the plot forward. That not only moves the plot forward story-wise, but shows the audience like, oh, they can lie. There's a lot more going on inside of these quote-unquote artificial beings than what meets the eye, which is to me super relatable to neurodiversity. Because I've worked with many neurodiverse people, myself being neurodiverse, and you've worked with many neurodiverse people as well, and yourself being neurodiverse. I feel like in my experience of what is perceived around how people are supposed to be and how people actually are, when it comes to neurodiversity, the way I would sum it up is like there's just a lot more going on inside of people than any of us, I think, really realizes. right? And it's going to look different for each person. And the power of that like, oh my gosh, there's even more humanity to explore than we could have even imagined in the differences that emerge in us through our very neurology. Right?
Mm-hmm. I think you cut out there a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know why
in
it's
the middle
cutting
of
out.
your.
Let me see if I can get closer. We can edit all this out. this stuff. So yeah, that's one of my experiences of being, this conversation is like just understanding that no matter what we think a person is because of how we perceive them, what's probably going on inside is much, much more, And I feel like that's practical beyond,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's just super practical. And I feel like it's practical for anarchism because, for me, anarchism it's all about mutual aid, right? It's about dissolving the unjust hierarchies, not because they're bad or wrong, but because if we can take the energy that exists at the top and empower everybody to carry that in what was once perceived to be the bottom, then it just seems like it would be maximum benefit for everybody. And so, if lifting each other up is desired, understanding that people are going to interpret that differently and neurologically you're going to experience the act of even trying to do that differently it's super important, because you could accidentally hurt somebody by doing something you think is kind based on what you perceive is kind, whereas someone else who might have a completely different brain structure is like, oh, that's physically painful, and then the misunderstanding creates conflict and et cetera, et cetera.
All right. So though they're all great ideas, I wanted to go ahead and introduce ourselves to the audience. Did you want to start us off?
Sure. My name is Eugene, and I'm an anarchist. And I in my studies of anarchism, I stumbled into anarcho-communism, which is what I found best described how I felt. It wasn't an ideology that I chose. It was just like, I was learning about all these ideologies that were emerging in my environment. That was the one I was like, that speaks to me. Like, just fucking share as a default, because that's how I've always experienced reality. You just share. Like, that seems to be like the best opportunity to dissolve any conflict. And and then in the last chunk of years, that's moved even further into what really motivates me, away from any need to like label it, but still using labels to kind of have things to hold on to and move back to and communicate from and through with people. I found Afro-communalism is really where my heart is at, which is the rooted in the theory that like all life literally, or all human life, emerged from Africa. So if we want the full picture of humanity, then it has to go back there, just logically. And so tracing that back and learning about it and finding how human behavior is changed in all its ways from coming from Africa to where we are now, and just getting really comfortable with learning more and more about tracing that history back and forth, back in time, forward in time, understanding what can we take from things that worked before, that if you just drop them in verbatim now wouldn't work, would be just destroyed really quick. Like, for instance, I can't remember I'm so bad with names. I can't remember what national tribe, what tribe it was of people, but there was an indigenous tribe that in Africa, I think, or it might have been Australia, that had this practice where it was just a cultural thing. It was just part of the culture. It wasn't a law. It was developed over time, where the better you did at something, the more shade you got. And it wasn't, and at first I was like, that sounds awful, right? And then I was like that just seems like it wouldn't work. And then the more I learned about it, I was like, oh yeah, I'm thinking about that from being a neurological agent that's been shaped by the present. And I have to like let that go to understand why that might have worked then. And then I thought about it. I was like, oh, it's not cruelty. It's almost like the dozens. You ever heard about like doing the dozens? Like in some black communities that I've spent time with and talked to, they would just start ripping on each other, like just talking trash on each other in ways I was like, God, so mean. But then they would be like laughing like motherfuckers, and like it was clearly lifting everybody up. And there was like this clear bonding. So I was like, that's not cruelty. But when I experience similar things over here where people are just talking trash on each other, it sure feels like cruelty. It doesn't feel like anybody's being lifted up. And so when I asked the elders in the community who suffered my presence, like, what's up with that? Like, how do you like, and I just tried to point out, and they were like, yeah, it's doing the dozens. And they, that's just a way of like relieving stress, and nobody's taking themselves too seriously. And everybody takes turn laughing at each other and laughing about themselves, letting themselves be roasted and roasting. It's like, I was like, oh, it's like, it's hacking the energy, the neurological process of humility and the joy of like, even though I've been humbled, I'm part of a community. Right. It's just fascinating to me. And it's helped me because as someone who generally tends to just immediately take things literally because of how my neurology works, I feel like it gives me specifically some like insight into like, oh, we don't have to, like the act of demonizing something or fetishizing something is going to be influenced by our neurology. Our neurology is influenced by our environment, and our evolution and our cultural evolution as well. And so in terms of like neuroanarchism, for me, a lot of part of anarchism is letting go of oppressive ideas and thoughts and patterns and forming new patterns and thoughts and ideas and practices. So understanding that I'm going to have a lot of strong feelings and around things around me doesn't necessarily mean that I'm right or wrong, because my neurology, especially as someone like, like I have to constantly check to make sure that what the information I'm processing is real all the time, because I'll make mistakes because of how I perceive things with my brain, like the way I take in sensory input and then how I experience that sensory input. Like part of my experience of being on the spectrum is like every thought has a physical sensation in my body, like all the time. It's like a fluttering lightning storm of thoughts, emotions, and physical sensations that is so overwhelming most of the time that it makes, and I always just assumed that everybody was experiencing that, and then they were just really good with dealing with it. And then I started learning as I got older, it's like, oh no, like people don't experience that. Like people, like they're not constantly having to push through so much information in their bodies and emotions and their minds just to do the most basic shit. And that's when, by the time I'd even had my own personal realizations around that, I'd already been working for years and years and years with disabled communities. I started working with mental illness first. I worked in group homes just to help create patterns of stability and health and growth for people that were struggling with like super, super severe mental illness based disabilities, depression so severe that it was like almost like people were comatose, and we had to figure out how to create plans to not force them away from what they were going to experience anyways because of their neurology, regardless of what anyone thought or felt about it. So this person is so depressed they can't move for a large period of time. And just figuring out, well, how do we generate support and health and growth given that, right? How do we how do we create autonomy for that person? Because autonomy is what facilitates growth, giving space for someone to grow. I worked with people that were severely schizophrenic. I worked with people that were severely bipolar, severe anxiety disorders that were like literally debilitating, like where certain people needed help doing just the most basic things, even though in other areas they might seem perfectly high functional. In other areas they were just had incredible blocks that they experienced because of how their overall neurology was working. And So when I started working with that professionally, and then that shifted over time into physical disabilities, and then that shifted over time. And it's hard to classify them as one or the other too, because bodies and minds are so interconnected. But it went from the mental illness, arena galaxy into physical disabilities. And then when I started working with that community, it started to split into both home and school. So I would work with people in schools and in group homes. And then from there, I started working with like severely disabled people, quadriplegics specifically, in a home environment. But I mean, not just in a home, but primarily in a home environment, extending out into the community for doing things and assisting them in community activities like doctor's appointments and just going out and seeing movies, being social or whatever, but it's rooted in the home. It would start there. And I grew up in special ed. That was what it was called when I was a kid. I was constantly being bounced back and forth between the gifted kids and the remedial kids, the special kids. They couldn't seem to find a place for me. And my home life was atrocious. I was raised by like super severe right-wing theologues who very much leaned into the rod is the guide. When you have, and that's a horrible environment for someone who's not neurotypical, because if you're not understanding what's going on and the people who are in power are using violence to dictate control, regardless of whether there's any understanding or not, it's just a feedback loop of violence, right? And so I've also, part of my experience of being neurodiverse, it's complicated because some of it is quote unquote organic, but other parts of it are clearly environmental, where like just experiencing PTSD for most of your formative years is going to affect your neurology. It's going to affect you and the neuroplasticity that you have to work with, given where you are in life, which it gets more difficult the older we get. So anyways, that's a little bit about me.
Yeah. So, my name is Tyler, and I'll go a little bit of the history of my experience with neurodiversity. Now, I didn't realize I was neurodiverse until actually just a year ago. I mean, I knew something was different about me for a long time, but I didn't have a name for it, because the media, schools, they all painted this picture of neurodiversity as the most extreme cases, the ones that were more obvious, whereas mine was more subtle and inside my own head. So to go to the start, when I was in kindergarten, I was held back because I was good with reading and the functional topics of the classes, but I was not very good at socializing. I always was by myself, trying to be solitary. Then when it came to first grade, I remember I used to get in a lot of trouble because I couldn't pay attention in class. I'd always start laughing randomly because of a joke in my head, and I could not control it. The more I tried to stop it, the more I'd laugh. And as a result, I remember my teacher always taking away my recess privileges. And
laughing.
I mean, I'll give her I was disrupting the class, but I seriously could not control it. What else? So going a few years, I was always like trying to be by myself, but also trying to be a part of groups because I felt like that was normal. But every time I got into the groups, I never felt interested in what the groups necessarily were about. Like the classical or the stereotypical high school cliques, for instance. I just never took to a lot of them. I was always an outcast, or an outcast being amorphous. Like one day I could hang out with the jocks. One day I could hang out with the nerds. Some days I hung out with people that didn't fit into any category. And, so it left a little bit of an identity crisis for me. But I also kind of got this sense that I was not really meant to be a category, like belong to a category. I started calling myself a chimera or a shapeshifter for this reason, because, like one day I was into one thing and then the next day I was in a totally different category. I've always jumped back and forth from interest to interest, and and it was hard to like find my place in the world because of this, because I just wanted to do a little bit of everything, but just could not focus on anything for a long enough time. So this kind of brings me into my anarchist views. Now, I didn't know what anarchy was until actually just a few years ago. I was jaded by this the hegemony, the education, where it always equated anarchy to chaos. Now, when I finally realized what the actual definition of anarchy was, I instantly realized that I was an anarchist. And the reason was because I never accepted, if someone told me to do something, I would always be the one to say, why? And they would get angry at it, saying, why isn't he just listening to us? Like everyone else does, so why isn't he? And I just could not accept, because I said so, as an answer. That always seemed so absurd to me. In classes, I would ask a teacher a question, and and they'd say, they wouldn't have a good answer. They'd just say, well, this is what's in the book. And I'd say, well, I don't know if I agree with that. Like, I need some logic or some actual, facts to back this up. And they'd say, well, this is what the book says. I said, I know what the book says. I just don't know if it makes sense to me. And, and so I didn't do so well. And I mean, I was always a B student for this reason. Like I could always I could always do just enough to get by in classes. But, this obstinance in me always kind of brought upon negative feedback between me and my teachers. And then when I got into college, I focused on chemical engineering, and I was always into science and math and all the natural laws of the universe, but, kind of stayed away from the social aspects. But one thing that was always constant in my life was never being as interested in the subject material of those classes, but related topics that, even though it wasn't good for my grade, was leagues more interesting to me.
I hear you on that.
So this is my experience with neurodiversity, is that I because I just never felt like I could be singled. I could never be boxed. I couldn't even control my own urges. It's just, and that doesn't mean like I do crazy things like touching people that didn't want to be touched. I want to be clear about that. I meant like, more like my own passions. I couldn't really control that like other people that I noticed, or maybe they weren't able to either, but just were able to make it look like they could. I couldn't do that.
Right.
But it wasn't until I started working for the nonprofit I'm working at currently that works with people with developmental disabilities that I started to see a lot of overlap between the person I work with and myself. And so it got me thinking, maybe this is what has, been making me different all my life. So I went to a therapist, and she told me everything I told her matches up with Asperger's. Now, I have reservations on calling it Asperger's because Asperger was a Nazi scientist who separated the high functioning and low functioning autistic people. And, that
gross.
brings me to my last point. My last point with the dichotomy of high and low functioning, aside from the gross history, the brutal history of it, it also it's reductionist. It lacks the dimension of, it seems to place this, if you can do math, then you're a high functioning autistic person. But when in reality, I have a lot of turmoil in my head. I sit there trying to read. I try and read a book, and in my head, I just get these random thoughts of like commercial jingles. In fact, I was one time sitting at my computer working, and my roommate was working next to me, and without even knowing, I just started singing a jingle on repeat. It was the Liberty Mutual one. It just went, liberty, 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 liberty.
Wow, that is an earworm, admittedly.
Yeah. And yeah, so it just kept going on. I didn't realize I was doing it, not until she said to shut the fuck up. And I was like, what are you talking about? And she's like, you were just singing the Liberty Mutual song over and over again. But yeah, so this is a little bit of my background. Okay, so. Whew.
Well,
take a break from that.
Yeah, let's take a break for a minute, and let me just tell you that I really appreciate you. Like, I really appreciate your capacity because you talk about a lot of life over a lot of time, and so I appreciate your ability to really, and vulnerably, and that's really badass. Like, being vulnerable is the shit, and I relate to so much of what you're saying. Like, and this has been my experience of learning about the nuances of neurology and how that relates to what is considered quote unquote normal and what is considered quote unquote not normal, or quote unquote crazy, or quote unquote stupid, or quote unquote retarded, or any of those other ableist, like pretty fucked up terms if you really dig into them. Man, I just really appreciate it. I hope that as we do this, like, I'm really looking forward to what I think is the inevitable experience of more and more people being like, yo, I relate to that. Like, I understand something about what's being talked about right now. And I maybe don't have the words, or maybe don't understand my feelings around it, but I have some kind of feeling that, like, yes, there's something about this. This is true. The value in it is that it's like we're finding togetherness because of our differentness. And even if we find differentness in ourselves and each other and with other groups of people, there's still this togetherness. And that togetherness allows us to then be as different as we need to be. And that's what I love about disability life, is that, and it's hard to talk about this abstractly because there's actually really practical historical things around this that are super critical. And it's difficult for me to marry the two because when I find, working in the disabled communities, being part of it, the neurodivergent communities, the people that are just not considered quote unquote normal, there is, how I say this, there's just this organic understanding of like, oh, like, yeah, we have to help each other. Oh, like my friend's in a wheelchair. Like, I can't just walk up these stairs and be like, come on, man, let's do this, right? Like, there needs to be some accommodations that get made, and they're not unreasonable. And this is where the conversation gets difficult, because we live in an environment where a lot of the accommodations that we're learning we just need because of how we're built are attacked. They're not just not even seen, but like to bring them up is to be like who the fuck are you? Like, you think you can just demand the world change for you? Like, and that becomes less obvious the more visually obvious someone's neurodivergence, their neurological, their biological experience is from quote unquote the norm, right? And so being part of that, just around that organic, like, yeah, we have to help each other. And then seeing that, like, this is completely not a conversation limited to access and functional needs, specifically from a disability standpoint. That this is a conversation that's just because it's based on meeting the needs of people. And those needs are so different, and we have to be so considerate and adaptable that it easily dovetails into any other number of human applications, right? Like, that's why I think ableism, like conquering ableism, is the final frontier. And it's the one thing, when I point it out, it pisses off everybody. It pisses off conservatives. It pisses off liberals. It pisses off anarchists all the time. Every time I start talking about ableism, everyone starts telling me I'm talking about identity politics, and it just blows my mind, because it seems to imply that people think you can just like decide to identify as a disabled person, right? Like, which is, I don't know. I don't get that. Like, I just don't. I don't understand how that could be possible unless someone's trying to specifically be deceptive, which I guess is possible. And if they're being deceptive, they're still just trying to meet a need, which means they're using what they got to get what they need, which is part of access and functional needs and where people's abilities are at. Like, think about somebody who has a disability related to the capacity to tell truth, right? Like, each of us is only a few neurological changes away from not even being able to recognize each other's faces while still being able to go about doing basic tasks, right? We can lose aspects of our cognition that make us, less functional or not, in ways that are super extreme. Like, have you ever read the work of Malcolm Gladwell or heard of him?
Wait, could you say that again? Yeah.
Have you ever?
I think you were cutting out again.
Have you ever read the work of Malcolm Gladwell?
No, actually, I don't think I've heard of him.
Check his work out. He does a lot of work on neuroscience and the science of perception and the science of cognition, and he's done a lot of work. He's kind of one of my heroes. I have a lot of heroes. He's one of them, and he has written several books on the science of cognition in time, like what our brains do and the amount that our brains do in the tiniest amounts of time. And he'll spend chapters and chapters just breaking down a whole second of neurological activity and what that implies about like how we're so robust as conscious biological agents and so fragile at the same time that the smallest changes can cause dramatic outcomes, and the most dramatic impacts can be absorbed and adapted to with simplicity at times, because our brains are just like, we're going to adapt. We're going to just make the world what it needs to be for the body to keep doing its thing. So like if someone has a disability where they can't tell the truth, it's and I'm talking about literally like something in their chemistry. If they try to tell the truth, they get a biological hit that's more powerful than their autonomous ability to tell the truth if they want to or not. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Right? And that perspective really fucks with a lot of religious perspectives, which ultimately boil down to, regardless of what's going on with your body, you have this thing called a soul, and the soul builds merit. It gets like tokens. It gets a currency. It gets money. It gets like, I don't know, like God money or something, whatever they think that you get by being good. And then you develop that soul to develop a character, which then gets rewarded. And that's just a whole lot of bullshit. Our brains are running the show, and the environment is running our brains. And somewhere in there, our individuality emerges. And that is like, I can't stress how beautiful that is. And the impedance of that beauty of the individual's complete, unfettered, unconditional, unique expression is such a gift to the world that I can't imagine stopping it. Like I just can't imagine being like, you need to stop being yourself, unless it's specifically like you need to stop being the self that is you that is beating your wife. Like stop. Yeah. And that's where I feel like the conversation of when we're talking about neurology and how neurology affects behavior and and how that's a feedback loop. Behavior can affect neurology can affect behavior. Mm-hmm. There's a hack I've been working on. And all the time I've been working with really diverse groups of people with just wildly different beliefs, perspectives, and biological experiences and outcomes of all that, is that at the end of the day, the only difference between fighting and dancing is an idea. That the two outcomes that are diametrically opposed, dancing being this joyous expression of freedom and love and togetherness, or not, you can dance alone, I encourage it, and the other one being conflict and war and hurting each other, right? That the same mechanisms are at play. The literal mechanisms, not the ideological mechanisms. Your brains process pain and pleasure on the same networks and pathways. So there's always going to be an opportunity somewhere in there for us to go, oh, maybe this, like, you might not have to change a ton to go from being in conflict to going in synthesis. And I think that's where the ideologues who say that character is the overall end all be all of, human validity and value. I believe they miss out on the capacity to see the actual labor that others are having to do, and where quote unquote merit emerges from that, whether or not it fits into a hierarchy of value or not that's perceived in the environment, right? And so, like, for instance, part of my neurodiversity is I the way I would describe it is like, I'll get a stimulus, not a check, like a stimulus, could be a sound, it could be a sound, it could be a smell, it could be a visual cue. Sound is the most impactful for me, but it could be visual, and it goes, it hits like a lightning. Even the simplest things, the tiniest little things will hit like a lightning bolt and just ripple through my entire body, to the point where I can't even focus on what it was that even caused the reaction in the first place. And it could be something as simple as like hearing a jingle. It really could. It could be as simple as hearing a phrase. It could be as simple as hearing a song, a tire screech. I mean, for the longest time, I had to be disciplined in not kind of like overreacting if I heard like running footsteps behind me, right? Like, because I would process as that someone's moving toward me really fast, right? Like impact. And then I would be like freaking out, and then it'd be like, oh, it's just someone who's like running to go get something. and like I wasn't in danger, but my body just kind of took over. I was like, you're in danger. So I've had to recognize that like my physical stimulus doesn't match up always with what's actually going on in the environment. And that's like the crux of my neurodivergence, right? And the thing is, though, is that what also accompanies those sensations for me, and this is where it gets really hard to be present, is that my visual brain just goes, I mean, it explodes. I see, only why, like, people talk about people being like, this person's a visionary, right? And it's always perspected in like, or presented in this like, oh, they're so great or whatever. And I am a visionary. To me, what that means is I can't stop seeing things in my head all the time. And so like someone will be having a conversation with me about something practically relatable. And in my head, I'm interpreting it as like this massive shifting geometry pattern of information and color. And then sections of it will sprout off into weird, fantasy simulations that play in just incredibly fast loops between like what could happen or not. And then I'll go back into the geometry and then people will be like, you there? I'll be like, oh, wait, what we're talking about, right? And that happens outside of my control all the time. So my whole practice of trying to be present in society is just trying to just pull that, like, what's the actual linguistics of what's being given to me right now by somebody. And I live in an environment where that's generally do something or be punished, right? And so that's the rub of anarchy for me, is not being able to catch up or articulate in real time with most people, and that being, therefore, I'm not a valuable person, right? So
yeah, I actually, that last point you said, it really hits me. Like, when it comes to, I have a hard time with engaging in discussion sometimes, because I'll have to think about what I'm gonna think about saying, and I have so much going on in my head, and it's not that I am not knowledgeable, not that I can't, think fast enough. It's that there's just so much going on inside of my head all the time that it's hard to, get it out. And, then I've always had this, self-consciousness, because of it. Like, am I going to end up saying the wrong thing? And it creates this anxiety and attack in me. I've gotten much better. Right now I'm a lot more articulate than I was when I was a kid. I just thinking about talking to people sometimes, like not just sometimes, but almost all the time, would send my heart racing. Like it just, just thinking about talking would make my whole body feel cold, and my heart would be at like double the speed it normally is. And it gave me this adrenaline rush, which both felt good, but also I could never get I could never get what I wanted out. And by the time I was ready to say it, the conversation had already drifted away, and I'd just be like, oh, well, I missed that again, and, and it's like, for that reason, I've always had this self-consciousness that people saw me as intellectually impotent.
That's really unfortunate.
That
that's their loss.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's, I don't know if that's actually how they perceived me, or if it was just me perceiving for them.
I see. Right.
And,
right.
Yeah, like this was all like a lot of internal turmoil.
Yeah.
It caused me a lot of depression in my life. And, I'm chronically depressed, not just due to the stimuli that I experience externally, but also like I could be having a very great life and then suddenly it goes boom. And, and it just like brings me down into like the lowest, where when I'm in that stage, I get very suicidal. Like all my thoughts are about like not wanting to exist anymore. A lot of times it's even like visions of me actually carrying out suicide. It's not always violent like that. It's always sometimes it's just passive, like if I'm walking down the street and something happened to me, I just don't care. I just I'm like, it's what it is, not really like having regard for my own self. And, a lot of this has been perturbed by this, like feeling like I can't get anywhere in life because of my, inner turmoil, my neurodivergence. So I, it's definitely a struggle, and I've always seen my life as kind of like, I have my peaks and troughs, but I don't consider it just a sinusoidal wave. I see it as generally a linear, an upward linear curve or line, but one that's superimposed onto a wave. So it's like I see my life getting better over time, but sometimes like I go down and and when I reach those very low lows, I sometimes trick myself into believing that it's only going down from there. And then it's only until I go up again that I'm like, man, I was kind of foolish for, for having these thoughts, so the neurodivergence definitely has played a big role in shaping my life. But I think even more than the neurodivergence itself was the lack of identity, the lack of knowing what this is. And this is why, I hear people complaining about identity politics all the time, as you said. And this doesn't necessarily just mean the blue-red dichotomy. This is like, I have an experience that I share with another group of people that other people don't. And for that reason, it shapes who I am. It shapes my politics, shapes my views. And, and it's not just for, restricted to people with neurodivergence. It's race, gender, sex, basically everything. Everyone has a different experience in life, and that's going to have a an effect on their perspective, their politics, their worldview. And so I definitely appreciate the bringing up of the identity politics, because I hear it a lot as people making it sound like it's divisive. And I mean, to a degree it is, but it's only because I have a different view based on my experiences than someone else that has a completely different view, and that's okay. And so what I bring back to anarchy and socialism is that, for me, I like the idea of empowering people to make their own decisions, removing this violence that's imposed upon them by a state hierarchy or a privatized hierarchy or any
theological hierarchy.
Exactly. Any hierarchies impose violence by removing our ability to make our own choices. But one thing I also want to say is that where ableism comes in is that some people want unlimited freedom to make choices and don't take into consideration that some people have a hard time making these decisions based on their abilities. And, so we can't just have equality. We need to have equity. We need to have justice.
Right.
Yeah.
And those are the thing is those are so vague, right? Just by the various things that you're laying out that talk about how different people are gonna be. Justice is gonna mean different things. It's gonna feel like different things. It's gonna be perceived, projected upon, and predicted from in different ways that are gonna cause conflict. It's inevitable, right? That and there's a few key points that you brought up, so I can keep them straight in my head, that I feel are really important. That they're important to me, and I feel like they can be expanded on in ways that are much bigger than my personal preferences, and that might be accessible to other people if they're coming at this conversation from any number of different places. One is that you spoke about not feeling part of any specific group throughout your life, right? So that's super relatable to me. And I've talked and listened to a lot of people that are on the spectrum who some of the like kind of the lingo, like the lingo that people kind of get, they just choose to kind of get comfortable with because they all understand what it means. It's just feeling like you're an alien. I'm not a human being, you know?
I've definitely thought of myself as an alien.
Right. Like this is a strange planet to be on right now. Like and that to me is like, it hits so hard. And it's so frustrating because in our political climate right now, we have people that seem like the whole, like, what's the snowflake vibe, right? That blows my mind. Like, welcome to the 21st fucking century, man, where it's like opposite land. Like we're going to make fun of people for perceiving to be all the same, of copying each other or something. And the symbol we're going to give them is something that's intrinsically representative of uniqueness. Like, are they trying to say that our perception of ourselves is unique is wrong? And they're there. So they're doing like a double flip irony thing. I don't know. But the point is like, that feeling of being like tribeless, right? I thought for myself, it was because like I was raised by Jehovah's Witnesses, and in a really specific, I was raised in a weird ass religion in a specifically weird ass location. I grew up in Santa Barbara, California, which is like the Riviera of California. Like Ronald Reagan has a ranch there, Michael Jackson has a ranch there. It's like peak California opulence. I was raised in the middle of that. And so I was being raised in this really weird religion, in this really weird place, being a really weird kid. So it's taken me decades to just unpack those layers of like, okay, I grew up in this religion that not many people can even begin to relate to what it's like, maybe. And I also grew up in a town that most people can't really relate to what it's like, maybe. And I also exist in a body that not many people seem to be able to relate to, maybe. And now that's the root of it for me. It's like, okay, so it all comes down to the body, right? Because if you're in a religion with somebody or you're in a town, you're going to have a bunch of different bodies. And that's going to color perspective dramatically, especially where people are. This is where the conversation of masking is, I feel like, hugely important in the conversation of neurodivergence and the perception of that, and neurotypicality and the perception of that, is that you talk about being a shapeshifter, and that's something that I relate to. And a lot of people I've talked to in this conversation, that's a theme that comes up, is being able to be many different things. It's because as someone who's not neurotypical, I've had to survive, you know? Like I've had to figure out, like, I don't understand what the fuck is going on around me. It doesn't make any sense to me. So I need to find the
I think you're cutting out a lot more now.
That's weird. I didn't even move. Let me see. I got full bars. Let me see if I can move closer.
Right. Yeah, it says that your network bandwidth is low.
I think maybe other people might be on the internet as well.
Yeah.
All right. So how much of that did you just catch?
I mean, it kind of stopped at where you were talking about your in Santa Barbara with like, so you're growing up in a weird town, weird religion, and you yourself perceive yourself to be weird. And then I mean, I also kind of zoned out a little bit. I had a little bit of a mental blackout for.
Okay, that's the cool part about recording this. I just did. I did a recording recently with some folks, and I go back and I listen to it, and I'm just like, oh my god, like I go too far too fast. You know, talking to folks, I'll start just talk about shit that to me makes perfect sense in my everyday life, but to them they're like, what? Talk about like geometric shapes and toroids and energy flows and interconnective crystals and shit. And everyone's just like, what? I'll be like, I mean, be nice to each other because it matters. And they're like, oh, okay, yeah. I get that. I'm like, but all that other stuff is related, I guess, but I don't know. I'll have to figure out how to communicate that shit.
Yeah. One thing I was going to say, I did need to get to some other things today. I don't want to cut us off, so I do want to have some final remarks, but I was hoping then we could continue this on later.
Hell yeah.
Plus gives us more, more material later on. But.
And I'd like to bring others in. There's doing the two people is really cool, but when you get three people, that's when it starts getting really badass.
I agree. I was thinking the same thing.
So are we cool with Neuropunk, or are we still gonna put that on the table?
I would definitely like to consider that a lot. That is a really good title. I think we should just go for it.
It is written. and a resounding gong happens somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds great. I never really considered myself so much of a punk because not because again, I have these preconceived notions based on how media puts it, but I've always been, I'm not the most conservative looking because I now have a beard and long hair, but generally, I consider myself vanilla style.
That shit is so absurd. That shit is so absurd. I never could understand that. They're like, I'm counting way more hairs on this person's face section than the situation should allow. I just don't get that. I mean, maybe food prep, wear a thing, but
and then like. Never dyed my hair, though I've had views of myself with dyed hair, and I will say maybe I'm getting a little bit less vanilla in about a month. I'm going to get my first tattoo, but if you don't
have a mohawk in 3 months, we're failing.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, I've had a lot of preconceived notions because you never see the more vanilla looking punks. You always see the same, wild hair, wild colored hair, a lot of black clothes with a lot of bright underclothing so it shows through, and like very flamboyant. And I believe myself, at least my outward appearance is probably the opposite of flamboyant. What goes on in my head might be different, but I've never wanted to attract attention to my physical person.
I relate to that. That's why I've avoided a lot of showy displays of physicality expression in my life. I try to stay hidden most of the time.
Yeah, and I mean, I definitely appreciate I appreciate walking down the street and seeing people wearing different colored clothing, different color hair. It kind of adds to this menagerie of life.
Well put.
If everyone was like the very typical blonde hair, blue eyes, 6 foot tall, clean cut. What do you say? All living in the same houses, kind of like what Edward Scissorhands. I was thinking Edward Scissorhands.
That's another good one. I love that movie. That movie I related to like a motherfucker as a kid. I was like, this is a story of my life.
Yeah. Like the nicest guy, but everyone just can't get over the fact he had scissor for hands.
And he just has no idea what's going on. He's just like, what? Sure, I'll cut your hair. What's going on? And you know what I liked about that? You know what I liked about that movie too is this is gonna get dark quick because it's a dark film. Is how they made a point to talk about the Predator vibe in that movie. How Edward, as a neurodivergent individual, was preyed upon by like sexual predators in the film. And it wasn't like it didn't get heavy, but remember the time where that one like the community leader Becky looking white woman like wanted her hair cut, and then she started putting her moves on him and getting all like slimy on him, and he was just like freezing up, and then she wanted him to like undo her blouse, and it was a poignant scene for me in like being like, for me, part of being neurodiverse is being gender diverse as well. Like I don't get the specificities of gender that are so required by people. It just never made sense to me. Because I'm non-binary, and but to have seen that film where like the main character, the protagonist who I identified with, was being predated upon, and then also growing up in an environment where I watched Star Wars, and then when like Han Solo is like pinning Leia up against the wall and being all slimy on her, and she's just like saying no, and he's like, oh, I'm a scoundrel, and I was like so uncomfortable, but like nobody around me was acknowledging that there was anything to be uncomfortable about. So I was like, oh, that's normal, I guess you just like, and it there's a lot of those messages in media that have to do with boundaries, and as someone who has like a super weirdly literal understanding of boundaries, it's always been really confusing about me when media just shows boundary violation is just like a normal thing. They're like, oh, it's just a thing that, heroes do, especially big, strong men heroes. And so then when I saw Edward Scissorhands, that one scene really affected me because I was like, that feels like this is supposed to be uncomfortable. This is this is specifically narratively supposed to be like, ooh, this is not a good situation, but it's like the exact same situation. It's just that the perspectives have been flipped. Right? Like if the movie was about Leia, right, and not Luke, that could have been a pivotal scene, and I highly doubt if it was realistic that she would be super comfortable being on the ship with someone who was like doing that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That was weird.
I think that would be a great topic for a future episode, is getting more in depth with how perspective shapes our own minds. I don't think that's something that's discussed enough, is just how easy we fall into the narrative, the perspective of the narrative, and even if it doesn't seem necessarily wrong, if you look at it from a different view, it can be drastically different. But I think this would be a great topic for like a whole video.
Yeah, let's do it. I'm into it. I think, I want to give a shout. Are you okay if I give a shout out to some fellow podcasters that are hopefully we'll interconnect with? Are you okay with doing that on the air?
Yeah. I'm not as familiar with the big podcasters, so
I'm not either. I've just been interacting with some few people that have been encouraging me to do my thing, and And I'm encouraging other people to do their thing. So there's there's Good Morning Mayberry, a really dope ass person is running that like all by themselves. Like that's what's really cool and amazing. And they are the one who even gave me the courage to like speak in front of people about any of this. Like, so that's a podcast that I hope to have the host on. His name's Shift Orion. I'd love to have him on as a guest. And then, and he's talking about perspective. I mean, he's talking about a lot of things, but how perspective changes things and affects things dramatically is definitely a subject of that him and others land on often. And then over at this other podcast, and this is where the shit gets dangerous. And the podcast is literally called The Cult of Dangerous Gentlemen. And these are folks I probably never would have talked with except for a wild.
You just cut out when I didn't hear the name of that.
Oh, okay. So the other podcast that I want to hopefully connect with and integrate and participate with, and just to help grow amazing new shit is The Cult of Dangerous Gentlemen, which is a podcast that I never would have been on or listened to had not a series of just incredibly trust-filled synchronicities that transcend my understanding of coincidence around things that are so important to me. I feel so strongly about that, felt so worth risking everything for, that I went on, and our interactions have been wild because we're very different people. They're centrists and libertarians, but labels are just, they're real dangerous these days, you know? And I give them those labels only as just like for anybody who's just seeking for a label to start. It's not inappropriate to say those labels. But this is the thing, is that I think we got to transcend all these labels and find a commonality that's ubiquitously healthy. Like that, like find results that give us practical, like, oh, this is why transcending these labels is helpful. And when I say transcendence, I don't mean like negation. Like we don't forget the information exists that we've been operating off of. We build from it into something new. It's synthesis. And so those folks are talking a lot about perspective too. And it's wild because it's like, if I was to be so fucking, I hate saying this, but if I was to be like, they're like right wingers and left wingers that are like in completely different ways, slowly working themselves towards these same conclusions. And I can see the synchronicities long before these people have even gotten to those aha moments, right? And so my goal is, especially with what we're doing, you know, is just to create these nodal points of communication and access and newness of information so that new behaviors that are practically accessible and deeply empowering of each other's individuality for the health of the community can blossom from our works that we're doing while we're slaving away at our jobs. Not that I slave away at my job, but there's people that do like retail and stuff that are, you know, probably not super happy doing stuff like that. And I don't know. So I feel like these conversations can create big bridges.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Yeah, that sounds great. Do you want end the recording and then we could talk a little
Neuropunk, baby.
Neuropunk.